So you've got everything into Nvivo, everything is coded, you've got your nodes, and this is when you can start having some fun. And it's basically using queries, reports, or doing further analysis of your data. And I think this is when your theoretical framework really comes very handy. So one of the things you might be doing simply is clicking on a node in Nvivo and start reading all of the references for that node. So for instance, here I can look at what people have said about communication and collaboration and the digital capabilities related to that. But if I then wanted to be a little bit more clever, and let's say I wanted to look at where people talked about engineering, in reference to engineering and communication and collaboration, then I can do a query wizard to do that. And there's a number of other options that here you can do. So you can look at particular terms. If people have mentioned it, you can also count frequencies. And this is quite useful, is what I mentioned now. Search for content based on how it is coded. So let's look at that in Nvivo. So it's something that you might do in Nvivo here. You can either set a query wizard or you can start it from here. It doesn't matter. There's a few of these saved here. So for instance, when I wanted to know where signature pedagogies and the implicit level was referred to in engineering transcripts or in engineering documents, then I use this query, and you basically set up a query and then identify where you want Nvivo to search for it, in what files, and then also coded. This is where you can specify the coding. So here, because I was interested in where people talked about in reference to engineering, and anything that was coded in terms of signature pedagogies at the implicit level, so about the values of engineering, and clicked OK, and then run the query, and then this is where you can then display the results. So what you're doing here is being a lot more clever and looking at really relationships through this. So whereas in your codes and nodes, if you just doing it on a one-sided basis, you might be able to display all the stuff. So on the one hand, you could just click on nodes and it will give you all the nodes that have been coded as implicit signature pedagogies. But when you want to display it in relation to another node, let's say if anyone mentioned it in relation to digital communication and collaboration, then what you do is run a query wizard or create a query, as I showed you just before then. So that's quite handy. And as I mentioned before, Nvivo is great at when you want to set up relationships and look at how people, if they mention, let's say, digital communication and collaboration and engineering, what that relationship might look like. Or the one I mentioned, queries, and then I talked to you about maps in the earlier video as well. So just before I showed you how I was looking at what the implicit signature pedagogies in engineering were, and then basically I distilled it down to these areas, and I did the same for management, and then slowly uncovered what the deep structure and the surface level was. So I didn't use this Nvivo obviously to create these, but in the background to creating visuals and distilling your findings, it was very helpful to follow through the noding structures. But the actual description and summary of the findings, I ended up using tables and figures that I didn't necessarily work in Nvivo for those. And so here I looked at the signature pedagogies of engineering, and as you saw earlier, I also identified the kinds of digital capabilities that were people mentioned in either working as a profession or what they were developing in students. And based on that, I developed a framework analysis, which I actually ended up using in Excel because it wasn't as as difficult and complicated to do. So I then ended up doing this in Excel outside of Nvivo. And I think that's fine, as long as you know what you're doing and you know what the benefit of the software was. But if something is easier actually to do it outside, then I mean, that's what I did here. So what I did here is for each of my unit of analysis, I looked at where the assessment tasks were involving one of the 6 areas of digital capability. And then I also added a color coding for that. So where I felt that this was really relevant, more relevant when students were asked to do some assessments. So for instance, using or preparing a Gantt chart for project management, I felt that based on what people were saying and the documentary evidence, that information literacy was quite a big part, because it's shaded darker here in terms of what students were required to do. And I used then this color-coded Excel chart to produce some of my findings and mapping that back on my on the GISC digital capability framework. And as you see, the darker the area, the more prominent the development required of students when they were getting ready to become professional engineers or managers. So this, once I've done this mapping, and again, it's something I did on the basis of my data outside Nvivo, not in Nvivo, because I couldn't achieve this visual in Nvivo. And then I went on to then looking at what you've seen earlier here, the relationship, looking at the relationship between signature pedagogies and then the kind of digital capabilities engineering and management students and professionals were involved in, and then basically came up with identifying the signature digital capabilities in each of the disciplines. I won't actually discuss my findings, but just this process is really just to lead you through of how I've gone from coding and categorizing through looking at what questions I was asking of my data based on my research questions, and how I started making relationships between my conceptual framework domains, which were the signature pedagogies and then the capability framework, and then ended up with distilling the signature digital capabilities for that. And if you wanted to hear a little bit more about how I've used theory in my research, then this slide will take you to my slide share of another presentation. But just to say that I'm happy to be contacted if you've got any questions about my use and my data analysis, and thank you very much.